So glad you could join this new episode of Tech Talk here on Best of High End. Today with us is Roland Hoffman. He's the Product Marketing Director at Steinway Lingdorf. And we'll be discussing, distortion. How does distortion influence the performance of our systems?
Yeah, many listeners think that distortion is something you would easily hear. For example, like if you're old enough to remember a distorted TV signal, right? So you have these big artifacts on the screen. You have a grainy picture. You have big pixels and zigzag lines over the screen. So it's very obvious. Okay, that signal is distorted.
Yeah.
But no amplifier does distort like that. Even the cheapest amplifiers out there, they don't really distort like you would hear it as distortion. And so the devil is in the detail. It's really much smaller things. So you might think, it doesn't matter. Distortion doesn't happen anymore. But it's so small. It's so hidden. So it's hidden in the details, and that moves you away further from the original sound without noticing it at first or without hearing it as a distortion. So distortion has many phases, and that's very small distortion. That can be just impurities or crosstalk, or it can be something is masked, or harmonic frequencies, harmonic distortion, linear, non-linear distortion. But they're all very small, and they all do something to the original sound without you really noticing it until you remove it. And then you suddenly hear, oh, that sounds better. And then you go back to the one with more distortion, and then like an ABA comparison, you really hear it, and the difference become bigger. You hear it, but again, it's not that you really remove a grainy sound as such or a noisy sound as such. It's much finer things that you remove. And there are so many things, especially in the analog domain, that can happen along the signal path from components or components degradation over time, or from components influencing each other. Less of that can happen in the digital domain, but still things can happen. But again, don't expect to hear it as distortion. But it's there, it can be measured, and it all moves you away from the original in its own mean way, because it's so well hidden and not so easily audible as such.
If I understand you correctly, there are many different types of distortion. Can you name a few, and what's their influence?
Yeah, well, there are many to differentiate. There's one thing is a linear distortion, which is it's so-called because it's in line with the original sound. So a good example would be an equalizer in the good old days. So you change the sound, you just change it. So in line with the original, which is not good. You don't want that unless you have an equalizer and you want to have the sound. But there's linear distortion, then there's non-linear distortion. That means it's not in line with the original sound, but it happens based on components or components influencing each other, or loudspeakers doing something. That is non-linear because it's not in line, meaning there are more frequencies aside from the original sound. So extra information that are not there, that are just created, like overtones that you don't want. And that, of course, is something that you can also a little bit measure, because you could see it in a measurement. You have this main frequency, and then you look a little bit to the right, meaning on the higher frequencies, and think, oh, what's that? There are more lines to it. But they're not there. They're not on the instrument or voice or whatever that recorded. So they're not supposed to be there. So what is that? And that is this nonlinear distortion. There are many more, and it's always important to find them and then do something about it. That's the main task of an engineer, actually.
Yeah, the one that keeps popping up in all the specs is total harmonic distortion, like THD.
Yeah.
Is that the big bad wolf?
Yeah, It's the big one, or let's say it's the most known one, because there's also intermodulation distortion and iron distortion. THD is also more like a summary of many things,
I guess
it's relatively easy to measure. That's not to say that it's easy to get rid of it. Most often it is kind of accepted, but as we can see from really modern amplifier, also naming the purifier again, you can reduce it a lot, and then suddenly you bring back the purity of sound and musicality and all these things by getting this THD down. But again, you can also measure other things, and that's what I say, intermodulation distortion, which is components influencing each other. That is something, and then you have small components that saturate while the signal goes through, and that also creates some distortion. So I would say THD. I wouldn't say it's the most important one. I would even say it's the most known one, where over the years, listeners and audiophiles learned that this is something where you have to take care of, but it's by no means all. There are so many more.
Yeah. So now that we've defined what distortion is and some types of distortion, what can we do to prevent distortion? Like for instance, a good amplifier design, when you open it up, a lot of the times you see that the power supply is kind of separated within the housing. Is that, like, for instance, a measure that you can take to prevent distortion, or are there many other things that we've learned to do?
Yeah, it's I mean, I'm not an electronics engineer, but the key to reduce distortion is to find it and to really measure it. And that got better and better. And I think the guys at Purify are ahead of that in finding distortion and then do something about it. You really have to measure it well. Or another example would be Room Perfect. Room Perfect calibration is pretty good at actually measuring the real room acoustical problems, because we take more measurements and we have more microphone positions, so it's more data. And that is also finding the distortion in order to do something about it. Because if you don't measure the right way, or if you don't measure enough, or you don't know how and where to measure, then you can do nothing about it. So the key part is to really find it. That very often means to visualize it, either on a graph or by numbers. Not so much to hear it, because, as I said earlier, the distortion doesn't show up as audible distortion as such, that you can easily hear it as a noise or hiss or anything. These days are thankfully over for most audio gear. So these days are over, so you don't hear it as such, but it's there. So it's more common that you really have to visualize it, exaggerate it, show it on the screen, say, wow, what's that? And then not accept it and say, do we get that down? We don't know yet if it's really audible or not, but let's find a way to get that down and then listen to the same component again, or find a component that doesn't have that extra information in there. So it's very often to visualize it and to make it visible in a graph or in whatever kind of spectrum that you see the problem, and then you try different things to get that down, away.
Well, you kind of introduced it, the guys from Purify. But if you take a look at what they are able to measure today, then we have not been as good in measuring things, distortion, in the past.
That's progress. That's what happens. They did an amazing job already years ago, before the amplifiers, when they had this drive unit. And the reason why this driver was better is that they measured things that are wrong in other really good drivers in the first place and tried to fix that. It is not that they first had this magic material or magic construction or magical components or another kind of alloy that they found. No. They started with measuring distortion much more thorough than anyone else before, and then thought about ideas to do something about it. And I think they have 9 or so different things, construction things, material things in the design of the driver to take care of different part of or different phases of distortion.
Yeah.
So it's not one solution for one kind of solution. It's not one solution for one kind of distortion. It's many different things.
But what an interesting way to approach progress by not thinking of using a new material or a new technique, but looking at the way to measure things. And if you look at that, then we made a big leap forward, because they are looking at things through a microscope, where a few years ago we were just looking at through a looking glass.
Yes, you could say so. Yeah, that's really a big difference. And it's surprising that you can still do that after so many years of having this dynamic driver and having amplifiers. And also Class D is not a new thing. We have this since many years now. But yeah, that's progress, and the better the measure, you measure, the better the result becomes.
This is turning into a big data show, because every topic we touch, it's all about data, getting to the data and handling the data.
Yeah. And that is also showing you that it's not so much about tuning an audio component. Many people think it's about the magic comes from tuning an audio components, give it a certain sound flavor. But I think I said it before, that suddenly we have Class D amplifiers out there and speakers out there that are so exceptionally good in their or low in their distortion, that now the terms of, oh, this sounds way more musical, comes back. These terms come back. So it is the same thing. You retain musicality if you get side effects out of the way. And that's where you bring back good sound.
Yeah, if I hear you right, you say we can only use salt and pepper in the recording studio. There we need to do some flavoring and nowhere else.
Exactly, and many more flavors. Use the whole kitchen, but please only at the studio and not on the reproduction side.
Yeah. Wow. What an interesting tech talk this was about distortion and how it influences the way we perceive our listening experience. Thank you for this one, Roland.
Welcome.
Thank you for watching this one. I hope to see you in the next episode. Have a great day.